Hey guys, just as a reminder before we jump into today's episode, and if you didn't catch last week's episode, this is going to be the start of our Patreon episodes that we are uploading here on Killer Instinct. If you missed it, I'll be posting 4 Patreon episodes over the course of the next few weeks while I'm away at my wedding. This gives you guys a chance to see what we're doing over on Patreon. It keeps our upload schedule uninterrupted, and it'll also give you more cases during my time off. So, with that being said, let's jump right on into it today. Hello everyone, what is up? Welcome back to another exclusive episode of Killer Instinct here on Patreon. Thank you guys so much for joining me here today. Happy August, you guys. How am I even saying that? How are those words true and coming out of my mouth right now? I do not know. It is absolutely crazy. Where is time going? I don't know if anyone else feels like this, but I truly feel like time is just flying by. I'm getting married soon. I feel like when I first started planning this wedding, it was like so far off in the future, like, oh, I have so much time. Now it's like, can time slow down a little bit? Anyways, with that all being said, I hope you all have had a great weekend. I hope you're having a great start to your week. I hope you're ready to jump into today's case with me, you guys, because this is a wild one. This is the case of Michelle Mockbee. It's a solved case, and it's one that is incredibly tragic, and it's one that still leaves you with more questions than answers. And so I'll be very curious to know what you guys have to say about this case. But with that being said, let's jump right on into it today. Michelle Mockbee was born on August 8th, 1969 to her parents, Patricia and John. She grew up being one of 4 siblings. She had 2 sisters and a brother, and Michelle was known to her siblings as their role model. She was the older sibling. They all looked up to Michelle. Her siblings described her as the kindest person. She was incredibly generous and someone who always spread positivity. Michelle also was known to have a top-tier sense of humor. Her loved ones said that she always had a vibrantness to her that was just constantly shining. Michelle worked as the head of payroll at a company called Thermo Fisher Scientific. It's a supply company that supplies laboratory equipment. And it was also at Thermo Fisher where Michelle met the man that would go on to be her husband, a man named Dan Mockbee. They connected at the office at a Christmas party in 1999, and the two got married in 2001 and continued working at Thermo Fisher together, just in different departments. Shortly after their marriage, they started their family. They had 2 daughters together, Carly and Madeline, and Michelle instilled kindness in her daughters. That was one of the many things that they take away from the time that they had with their mom. They remember Michelle always telling them to be nice to people, and Michelle also led by example with that. Michelle and Dan were very family oriented, and they were also big on prioritizing their relationship and their marriage. They would always plan a date night. They made sure to always have it in the calendar. They had a schedule for every other Monday for their date night, and Memorial Day of 2012 was no exception to that. They went out to dinner that night, and according to Dan, everything was normal. Him and Michelle were in good spirits. They had a great evening together, but less than 12 hours later, everything changed. Michelle woke up on May 29th, 2012 and headed into work early for her morning shift at Thermo Fisher like she always did. She went into work alone because Dan had the day off that day. Sometimes when their schedules aligned, they would go into work together, but on this specific day, Dan had the day off, so Michelle was going into work by herself. Michelle left the home and headed to the office, and the company's security cameras captured Michelle pulling into the parking lot at approximately 5:53 a.m. on May 29th. She then walked into the building and clocked in for work and walked to the upstairs offices, not knowing she would not walk out of that building ever again. Now, to give you a little bit of an understanding of the layout of Thermo Fisher, this was an over 100,000 square foot building. There were warehouses, different departments, so it was a very, very large building. And about an hour after Michelle arrived to work, there was a supervisor named Ed Yeska who also arrived to work and walked up the stairs to the section of the building where some personal offices were located, including Michelle's office. Now, when Ed walked up to the hallway that had several of these offices, he was shocked to find what appeared to be a blood stain in front of Michelle's door. It appeared that there had been somewhat of a blood trail starting from Michelle's office and leading to around the corner. And when Ed turned the corner of the hallway, that is when he discovered Michelle laying on the floor in a pool of blood. She had a plastic bag covering her head, her arms and legs were bound, and her hands were behind her back. Now, Ed immediately recruited one of the other workers nearby. There was a janitor named David Dooley, and David held the door open while Ed cleared out the rest of the floor. Ed wanted to make sure that there was no one else on that floor that was injured or hurt or needed help. And when he realized that there was no one else there, Ed immediately called 911 and reported that someone had been murdered at their offices. Now, when police arrived to the scene and first saw Michelle, they realized that, like I said, there had been blood stains seeped into the carpet. And that blood trail led to Michelle's body, which showed them that whoever attacked Michelle most likely did so right outside of her office and dragged her body to where it was ultimately found. They took a look at Michelle's office door and saw that it appeared that someone had been trying to break into her office. Michelle had a private office. It was just hers, and she would lock it at the end of every night when she was leaving work. And it appeared, based off of the way that the door frame was, it almost looked like someone was trying to break into her office. What this also showed police is that Michelle actually never made it into her office that morning. Whenever the attack happened, it happened right before she was able to walk into the office, almost like she came face to face with her attacker when she walked on to the office floor. Michelle's autopsy showed that she had at least 4 major blows to her head. She also had large cuts on her wrist, her ear was cut, she had a broken arm, and abrasions on her feet. The medical examiner revealed that they believed that Michelle was struck on the head and dragged viciously by her right arm across the floor, causing it to break. And the dragging would have also resulted in the scrapes on her feet and the blood stains in the carpet. Now, word of Michelle's murder traveled very fast throughout the Thermo Fisher team, and quickly coworkers began calling and texting Dan, telling them that there had been an incident at the warehouse. Now, without having too much information, Dan immediately got into his car and drove over to Thermo Fisher, and he noticed the surplus of police cars and first responders. Dan said he walked over to one of the officers and told them that he was the husband of Michelle Mockbee, and he wanted to know if she was all right because he did not know what was happening at that point. But that is when his world was turned upside down and he learned the devastating news that Michelle had been killed. Now, despite Dan just hearing the worst news of his entire life, police still had to question him regarding his whereabouts leading up to and at the time of Michelle's murder. Dan told authorities that him and Michelle, like I previously mentioned, went to dinner the night before. They had a great night together. They went back to the house. They fell asleep. Michelle woke up earlier that morning because, again, she was going to work and Dan had the day off. Dan said that he was at home sleeping during the time of his wife's murder and that he did see Michelle leave for work that morning. However, again, he stayed in bed. Authorities asked Dan if he would be willing to take a polygraph test, and he reluctantly agreed, knowing that if he failed, he would just be putting a bigger target on his back, but he did agree to do so, and he did pass the polygraph test. And that was enough for police to eliminate him as a person of interest in this case and move on with their investigation. Now, the next thing that police did was look at who else was in or at the warehouse during Michelle's murder, starting with the employees. They wanted to know what employees were at the warehouse warehouse that were working that morning. And through that, they learned that there were 13 employees that were on the clock at the time of Michelle's murder. And detectives interviewed all 13 of them. However, none of them reported seeing or hearing anything suspicious. Like I said, the warehouse itself was over 110,000 square feet. There was also a lot of sounds and noises going on. You have a distribution center, you have a packing center. It's all happening in this one facility. And so there's a lot of moving parts happening. And along with that, police also learned that all 13 employees were on the warehouse floor during the time of Michelle's murder, and Michelle was on the office floor. So they were located in completely different areas of the facility, only further proving the point that they just were nowhere near each other at the time. And because there was nothing that pointed to any of the 13 employees, police had to move on from them as well. They then looked at the surveillance footage of the warehouse, and this is when they did spot something a little unusual. At 6:31 in the morning, police spotted a red truck speeding out of the Thermo Fisher parking lot from the back of the building. Now, the reason that this stood out to them was because this was at the time where most people were coming into work. Usually no one was leaving the building at 6:30, but it seemed that this red truck was leaving, and not only leaving, but leaving in a hurry. They were able to match the truck as belonging to janitor David Dooley. Like I said, David was the janitor that Ed had recruited to help kind of keep watch when Ed initially discovered Michelle's body. So David's truck was seen leaving at 6:31 a.m. and then it was seen returning back to the warehouse at 7 a.m. Now, prior to looking and finding this surveillance footage, police did speak to David. He was one of the people that they spoke to regarding Michelle's murder, who claimed that he had not seen, heard, or noticed anything suspicious, but he never mentioned to authorities leaving that morning, which struck police as odd. They figured that that was something that he would share. Now, police then spoke to him again after looking and seeing the surveillance footage, and David claimed that yes, he didn't mention leaving, but he didn't think that it was important to mention. David said that when he left at 6:31, he went back to his apartment where he lived with his wife Janet, who also worked at Thermo Fisher. Janet was actually the one who had hourly pay at Thermo Fisher, working as a cleaner for the warehouse, and David was brought on by Janet after Janet was hired. So the two of them worked almost as like this tag team duo to clean the Thermo Fisher offices together. But David was the only one working that morning. Janet was still at home. Now, upon speaking to both David and Janet, David did admit that yes, he went home the morning of Michelle's murder at 6:30. He claimed that after Michelle's body was discovered, he began calling his wife Janet, but didn't get an answer. And because of the nature of everything, because adrenaline was running, he had just seen Michelle's body, because again, him and Ed were the ones that really found Michelle. He claimed that he was feeling nervous and anxious, and when Janet wasn't answering, he decided to drive home and check on her before returning back at approximately 7 a.m. He said once he went home, saw Janet, realized everything was fine, he got back in the car, turned around, drove back to Thermo Fisher. Police also learned that on the day of Michelle's murder, both Janet and David were scheduled to work together. However, Janet had been sick in the weeks leading up to the murders and stayed home sick on the day of the murder. So she had been out for several weeks at that time, and David was the one who was covering both of their shifts, really. Now, this conversation with David and the authorities was happening at David's apartment, and Janet was present. And during this interview and during this conversation, police did pull Janet aside as well. They separated Janet and David and asked Janet about David's whereabouts to see if she would confirm his story that he came back to the apartment at around 6:30 a.m. that morning. But this is where things got a little confusing. There was an audio recording of this conversation. Detectives were recording this conversation between them and Janet. And according to authorities, when police asked Janet if David came home that morning, Janet said no. Now, the reason that this is confusing is because Janet is mumbling heavily in this audio recording. So when police went back to hear this again, it was hard to confirm what she really said. The detectives who were face to face with her at the time said that Janet said no. David did not come home. But when you listen to the audio, it's not as clear as that. I've listened to it multiple times over and over again. And while it does sound like she's saying multiple words or a sentence or two, you can't really make out what she is saying. But according to the detectives who were questioning her, they are adamant that Janet said that David did not come home, which obviously contradicts David's story. Only one of them could be true. He either came home that morning or he didn't. So, police brought Janet into the police station for a proper interview. And when they sat down with her this time, they told her, you denied that David came home that morning. You did not confirm his alibi. You said that you did not see him the morning of Michelle's murder after he left for work. He did not come home around 6:37 a.m. And when Janet heard it this time, she almost seemed surprised that she said that. She responded with, I did, as in, I did say that. I almost forgot. It wasn't like a, yes, I did say that, but, or a, no, I didn't say that. I said that he did come home. She seemed surprised at what police were telling her. Now, this time she did offer police different information. She changed her story this time when she's sitting down with police. She claimed that David did, in fact, come home that morning, and the reason for him coming home around 7 a.m. was because he ripped a pair of pants. Now, this was information that police had not heard before. David never mentioned that he went home because he ripped his pants. He said he went home because he was concerned about Janet. So there seemed to be some confusion going on in both of their stories. And with the ripping the pants story, this made police a little concerned, a little suspicious. Why did David rip his pants? Was it because he got into a fight, a struggle, some sort of altercation? They wanted to know more. So police then spoke to another employee at Thermos Fisher named Joe Seegert, who claimed that he spoke to David that morning of Michelle's murder on May 29th, after David returned back to Thermos Fisher at approximately 7 a.m. And according to Joe, he claimed that he remembered David explicitly telling him that he had to leave work because he ripped his pants. So now you have two people saying that David went home because he ripped his pants. But when police told David this, David was adamant that he never said that because, according to him, he didn't rip his pants. Now, I will say, it is a little odd that two people who were not connected to each other, being Janet and Joe, both said that David told them that he ripped his pants. It just seems a little questionable. Now, police did get search warrants for David's car and his apartment. However, nothing suspicious was found. There was no new evidence found, no bloody clothing, no weapons, nothing. Police did test the plastic bag that was found over Michelle's head, and while there were multiple DNA profiles, one of those was in fact David Dooley. So even though David's wasn't the only DNA profile on that plastic bag, it was one of them. And it was when the discovery of that DNA profile became apparent, this is when David really became the key suspect in this case. Police also tested David's janitor closet and found industrial bleach that had been used to clean the closet soon after the murder. And given this, in September of 2012, David Dooley was arrested for Michelle's murder. Now, you might be sitting here wondering, is there enough evidence to really convict him of that? Is there enough evidence for even an arrest? But we're going to get into all of that now. Now, David pled not guilty for the murder of Michelle, and his case was headed to trial, and the trial began in 2014. The prosecution created a timeline of all the other employees that were at Thermos Fisher working the morning of May 29th. They showed where everyone was, what they were doing. It was very intricate. It was very detailed, and their reason for doing that was to be able to say, look, we can put all of these people, we know where all of these people were during that time, we know what they were doing, we can place them in the warehouse doing this at this time, but we can't do that for David Dooley. what was David Dooley doing? And they created a theory for what they believed David Dooley was doing. The prosecution theorized that on the morning of Michelle's murder, David Dooley was trying to break into Michelle's office, which would account for the markings on Michelle's office door. They believed that unexpectedly to David, Michelle walked up the stairs and saw that David was attempting to break into her office. So Michelle is now witnessing a crime right in front of her. The prosecution also stated that the reason that they believe that there was no evidence of any bloody weapons, clothing, or anything of that sort was because David, as part of being a janitor, walked around with a rolling trash can. And the prosecution believed that David put all of the evidence into a trash bag and took the bag with him when he left the facility at 6:31 a.m., which is what is seen in the surveillance footage. Now, the defense, on the other hand, they were very clear that they believed that there was not enough evidence in this case to convict David of murder. There was no DNA evidence other than the DNA on the plastic bag. There was no markings on David. He had no physical markings on him that showed a struggle. There was no murder weapon or blood evidence. There was none of it. They also talked about a lot of the differing stories between David and his wife, and they concluded that Janet had hearing problems. It was said that Janet had diagnosed hearing loss, and Janet must have misheard David when he told her that he was coming home. Janet said that she had seen a pair of ripped pants in their apartment that day, so she assumed that that's what David said on the phone to her. But the only thing that I have to say about this is that I too have someone in my family who has pretty severe hearing loss, and there is a big difference between someone telling you that they are coming home because someone in their office was murdered and they were worried and they wanted to check on you because you weren't answering your phone, and telling someone that you're coming home because you ripped your pants. Those are two very different things, despite the hearing loss. And I feel like I'm able to speak on that because I have firsthand experience with it, or secondhand, because again, it is a very close family member of mine. Now, at the end of the defense's argument, the defense also brought up that they believe that David had no motive to murder Michelle. They believe that there was no reason, no motive. They said that there was no motive for murder, and then they rested their case. But after the defense rested, the prosecution came back with an answer to that question. What was the motive? Now, according to the prosecution, they believe that they know exactly what the motive was. The prosecution theorized that David was falsifying time cards for him and Janet for their hourly wages at Thermos Fisher. It is believed that during the few weeks that Janet had missed work, because remember I told you that Janet hadn't been feeling good, she was sick, and she had missed several weeks of work leading up to the murder. It is believed that David was still clocking in her time card, so falsifying that she was at work, and therefore she would get paid, and she would be getting paid for hours she did not work. You get where I'm coming from? The prosecution stated that they believed that Michelle was starting to pick up on what David was doing because, again, Michelle handled the payroll. That was her job at Thermos Fisher, and they believed that Michelle was starting to pick up on what David was doing, falsifying the time cards, and that is why David tried to break into Michelle's office to steal the time cards, and that is when it would be believed that he came face to face with Michelle unexpectedly. Now, for some, this seemed like a reach of a motive. However, it was a motive nonetheless, and the prosecution stated that desperate people do desperate things. Something else that points to this motive being plausible is because of the time cards for David and Janet for the week of the murder were never found. To this day, they've never been found, leading the prosecution to theorize that David did in fact steal them and he threw them away alongside the other evidence. Now, after both sides did rest, the jury went into their deliberations, and after a day of deliberating, the jury found David Dooley guilty of the murder of Michelle and sentenced him to life in prison. After his conviction, David was still adamant he did not kill Michelle, and 2 years after his conviction, this case took a wild turn. It was alleged that the lead detective of this case, a man named Bruce McVeigh, and the lead prosecutor of this case, Linda Talley Smith, were having an affair. And that affair uncovered some hidden truths about this case that were not previously presented. Now, according to the two of them, this affair began weeks after the David Dooley trial began, and it did not end well. It actually ended with an 18-page letter that Linda Talley Smith wrote Bruce McVeigh, claiming that he was a liar, both personally and professionally. In the letter, she wrote, quote, "Now that I know what a fucking liar you are, I'm going to have ethical issues with every case in which you were involved. Not to mention the fact that you allowed me to go through a complete fucking murder trial without telling me the truth about that video. And now that I know it, what the fuck am I going to do now?" End quote. Now, just to give you some context, like I said, Bruce McVeigh was the lead detective of this case. And so when looking at a letter from the lead prosecutor that says that Bruce is a liar, both personally and professionally, it led for some speculation and for some suspicion. Now, once the defense and David's team, his legal team, found out about this, they brought this to the judge, and the judge heard a testimony from both Linda Talley Smith and Bruce. Because at this point, David's legal team was trying to overturn his conviction. They were trying to get him a new trial, and they figured that by presenting the evidence of this affair and this letter, that was the perfect way to do it. Now, in Linda's letter, she did reference a video, and the video in question was brought up during her testimony, and it was revealed that the video that she's talking about was from surveillance footage outside of Thermos Fisher on the day of Michelle's murder. Now, in the video, there is a random man walking through the parking lot. You can see he's coming from the street side, walking through the parking lot and out of surveillance footage view. Now, he is seen doing so at 8:11 p.m. So obviously this is much later on in the day. It's over 12 hours after Michelle had been murdered. So could this be nothing? Yes. But could it be something? Well, for the defense, it was really everything. They had a random man walking on the premise of the same building that Michelle was murdered in at 8:11 p.m., and they didn't know who this man was. So it gave them someone else to point the finger at, which is what they were looking at all along. They had no one else to blame in this case other than David up until this point. But now they see this random man who's they're able to put the blame on. That's all that they needed. Now, Linda Talley Smith stated that she did not know about the man in the video during the trial because this video was never brought to light. So that was the big issue here. This surveillance footage was never shown to the defense. It was never shown to Linda Talley Smith until after the trial was completed. And according to her, she said it wasn't until after the trial that Bruce even told her about it. And she said when she learned about it, she didn't say anything either. Linda stated that even with the new information of the random man, that's all it was. It was a random man. It didn't prove that David wasn't guilty just because an unknown man was walking through the parking lot 12 hours after Michelle was murdered. So as you can imagine, with this coming to light, David Dooley and his legal team really used it to his advantage, and they argued that David deserved a new trial, which he got. The new trial began in 2019, and the new prosecutor of this case was a man named John Heck. John claimed that when he reviewed the case from the beginning, he believed that David was guilty. He knew that whoever committed this murder had to be someone who knew the facility, someone who knew where Michelle was. So that leaves you with a group of people. It leaves you with a group of employees because based on the surveillance footage, you're able to account for all of these people walking into the building. And then you have to look at who left the facility shortly after the murder, which knocks you down to one person, and that one person is David Dooley. John Heck emphasized this video in question of the random man walking through the parking lot. He played the video and he showed, yes, there's a random man walking through the parking lot. This man did appear to throw something in the trash can that was right by the front door of the facility, but The man wasn't suspicious. He wasn't trying to break in, and he was never identified. To this day, he's never been identified. John Heck also stated that the one thing missing that the prosecution believed to have been vital in this investigation were David's steel-toe boots that everyone at Thermo Fisher was required to wear. The prosecution believed that David would have had a hard time washing the blood off of his boots, which is why they have never been recovered, and they believe he most likely disposed of them alongside the other evidence that he got rid of from the crime scene. The prosecution also stated that they believed that Janet and David's conflicting stories were very suspicious. They believed that Janet knew way more than she was letting on. They showed interviews from the very beginning where Janet claimed that he did not come home the morning of the 29th, like he said, and then how she started to change her tune. She said that he did come home, and then when detectives questioned her again about why did she say initially that he didn't, she said she didn't know. She said that she actually remembered saying that he didn't come home, but she didn't have a reason for why she said that. So she was admitting that she denied it at first. It just led for a lot of speculation, especially towards Janet. Again, I feel personally, because we're on Patreon, I feel like it's more of an open conversation here. My personal belief is that Janet knew way more than she was letting on in this, and I believe that whether she knew what David's plan was or what happened after the fact, I do believe that she knew more than she was letting on. Now, other circumstantial evidence that the prosecution pointed out was the fact that David claimed that on the morning of Michelle's murder, he was cleaning the offices nearby where Michelle was killed. However, the prosecution pointed out that if that were really the case, David would have heard or seen or noticed something. He would have seen the real killer entering or exiting the offices, but he claimed he never did. David claimed that he spent his morning cleaning other offices. However, basic cleaning duties were not done that morning. There was trash bags that weren't emptied. There was coffee that wasn't cleared out from the night before. Basic cleaning duties were not taken care of that morning. Now, the defense again stated that all the evidence against David was circumstantial. They even pointed the finger to Michelle's husband, Dan, and claimed that he was trying to obtain her life insurance policy. The defense also stated that they were not denying that David was stealing, which was a big thing in this trial that was emphasized more than it was in the first one. The defense said that he did steal. He was stealing the time cards, and he was clocking in more hours than he should, but they claim that that does not mean that he was a killer. So now it was all in the hands of the jury again, and after 7 hours of deliberations, David Dooley was found guilty of the murder of Michelle Mockbee, and he was sentenced to 43 years in prison. He was found guilty yet again. Now, I'm very curious to know what you guys have to say about this. Do you believe that Janet knew more than she was letting on? Do you believe that she actually had no idea at all? Do you think that David set out to kill Michelle that morning? Or do you believe in a moment of panic it was more so a blitz attack? Let me know what your thoughts are below. But with that being said, you guys, it's going to be all for me today. Thank you guys so much for tuning in to another exclusive episode of Killer Instinct here on Patreon. Make sure you stick around make sure you tune in for tomorrow's episode of Killer Instinct. I'm pre-filming these Patreon episodes because I've got a lot of stuff coming up in the next coming weeks, so I'm not sure what episode of Killer Instinct you're getting tomorrow, but make sure you tune in for it. And with that being said, I will see you then, and until then, you guys, stay safe.